Thank you so much, Daryl. It's great to be here. In fact, it's an honor because I think the work that you guys do, not only in your own organizations, but for the country and for the world, I think is extremely important. And as a business person, I don't think we thank you enough for what you do in solving a lot of the big problems and challenges that we have. And one of the themes I want to talk about is how I think business, government, education, and the social sector have to work much more closely together to deal with the times that we're facing. So what I wanted to do over the next 30 minutes is basically start with a bit of context, because I think when we think about leadership, you can't lead without knowing the context in which we're leading. And the basic point that I want to make to you in the first part is that we're going to have to lead in a very different way over the next 20 to 30 years than we have in the previous 20 to 30 years, because this next 20 to 30 years are going to be historic from a 300-year time frame. And that's as I said, people said it's a pretty outrageous thing to say, and I won't be around and you won't be to know whether that's true or not. But I hope I can show you some of the reasons why we think there are big shifts. And that requires all of us to challenge our orthodoxies about why do we do things the way we do them? Why does our organization work in the way we do it? And that's leaders that have to drive that as we go through it. So let me start with these mega trends, and I'm just going to go through this very quickly, and again, it's just a context piece. There are 5 big forces that we see in the world that we think are going to cause this time of significant shift over the next 20 to 30 years. And I'm just going to go through a couple of them. The first is this, what we call rebalancing of the world. We're basically going to see the economic power of the world shift back to where it was 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, more towards Asia and Africa. And this chart is just a very simplistic way to say if you were able to put the Earth on a flat piece of paper and try and balance it in terms of where the center of gravity is, in the year zero, it was somewhere north of Afghanistan in terms of where it would. So there was a lot more of the east than the west. Over a 2,000-year period, it moved basically towards Iceland. But very quickly, so it took 2,000 years to get to Iceland. It's taken basically 20 to 25 years to get back to where it was before. So the speed with which we're moving and the scale at which we're moving is in a very different dimension. And so that's one of the forces that we have to think about. And what's driving it basically is urbanization. It's the urbanization of China, where you have basically 250,000 people a week moving from rural areas to cities every week, no matter whether there's SARS occurring, whether there's the great financial recession, whatever the external issue, people keep moving from rural areas to the cities. So it's like gravity. And that's happening in many of the largest countries on the planet, in India, in China, in Indonesia. And what that's going to lead to is a middle-class population, a new middle class, an incremental middle class of 2.2 billion people. And that's going to happen by 2030. That's in our time horizon as leaders to be thinking about. This isn't way out there, this is happening now. And just to put that 2.2 billion number in perspective, the Industrial Revolution, which was the last major shift on the planet, if you think about the number of people that were involved and the time it took for those people to get to the middle class, this number and scale is about 1,000 times bigger than that. So this is going to happen very quickly. It's 1,000 times the scale. And that's going to affect everyone. It's not just what happens in China and what happens in India. It's going to affect what happens in Canada. Because as I'm going to talk about this later, those 2.2 billion middle-class consumers want to live like the other middle-class consumers. They want to eat the same. They want to buy the same goods. They want to work in the same way. And that's going to put huge demands on the Earth's resources like we haven't seen before. And it's going to require a different level of cooperation to make sure that this happens, because we can't stop it. It's going to happen. And so we just need to think about that dimension. And that's really around this resource scarcity issue that I wanted to talk about. When we think about those 2.2 billion people, and we then look at our resources, and I've just tried to sort of boil it down to 3 areas: water, energy, and food. Those are the core elements. We think that there will be an excess demand for water versus supply of 40% by 2030. And the problem with water, right, is it doesn't follow political boundaries. It doesn't really care who's in government or where things are. It's going to go where it wants to, and that's the way it works. And we're seeing a lot more tensions actually today in the world because of water. China and Vietnam are having a lot of tensions because the Chinese are damming a lot of the rivers that are going into the Mekong. The Vietnamese are saying that's key to our agriculture and our livelihood, and the Chinese are saying that's kind of too bad because it comes through our territory first. Ethiopia and Egypt are going to get into difficulty because Ethiopia is going to become a breadbasket. They're going to become an agricultural powerhouse, and they are the ones that are where the source of the Nile is, not Egypt, even though Egypt believes that the Nile has always been with them. So these are some of the tensions we're going to have to get ready for. I also worry about oceans. Oceans, 70% of the oceans are ungoverned, and given what we as humans have done with fish, I don't think we should be too excited about what happens when we start drilling for iron ore 3,000 meters below the surface, which, by the way, is starting to happen. So we're going to deal in literally uncharted territory. There's not a government to be able to deal with it, but as human beings, we have to solve it and figure out what we're going to do on that front. Energy, again, I think this is probably well known, but we're going to need to be thinking about how we conserve our energy. I mean, and that when I think about your latest business venture and storage and so forth, we have to figure out ways to use our resources more effectively. And this is something that business people need to lead on. It's not something that the social sector or Greenpeace or others should be only thinking about. It's something that business needs to think about, because if you don't, we don't have a license to operate. We have to figure out how we use it. And that's what we're seeing, and I'm going to come to this from the leadership changes. You start to see organizations having a higher purpose. It's not just to make money. If you think about Cargill, right, one of the largest commodity traders in the world, their purpose is their purpose, which actually drives their leadership team, is to provide the best nutrition for humans. That's their purpose. And you can say, but they also make a lot of money. They're there to make money, but they have a social purpose that drives them. And you're seeing more and more organizations doing that because they have to deal with this. Food, as I mentioned, is going to be a very big issue. I think, by the way, again, this is a massive opportunity for Canada to play a role in this. In fact, in all three of these areas, we are naturally blessed with what we've got. There's a question as to whether we use those resources very effectively. I think we are actually one of the biggest wasters of water, maybe because we have so much. But again, these are topics that are not off for academics or for foundations to be thinking. These are business issues that we have to think about. And that's why you see more and more business leaders being involved in these types of topics as we go ahead. We have to do that. A third force that we're going to have to grapple with is a very significantly aging population on Earth. We will never be as old as humans as we will be over the next 20 years. And so when you think about this, the proportion of the world's population over the age of 65 doubling, 400 million people over the age of 80. And again, I think that's wonderful because we're going to have a lot more wise people doing things. But the other thing we have to say is a lot of medical costs. If you look at where the costs ramp up, it's in the last 2 or 3 years of a person's life, and as we get older, that is going to go up, and the impact on GDP is going to be significant unless we think about our health. One of the biggest liabilities on government balance sheets, we've looked at this around the world, in fact, the biggest liability on government balance sheets is diabetes. That's a big issue, and that's why I think food companies are going to have to start thinking about what's our role in this, because there's going to be a broader responsibility. Anyhow, the aging population is going to be a new factor that we're going to have to think about. I'm an optimist. I think there's a lot of opportunities from that, but it's going to require change. One very minor example, I would say, is on education. And this is something I actually learned from David Naylor at the University of Toronto, but he always talked about, he'll say, Dom, how are you doing on your physical fitness? He'll say, how are you doing on your brain fitness? I said, what the hell does that mean? He goes, because you're going to have to think about, you're going to work for a long period of time, and you've got to think about keeping your brain moving, and you've got to think about lifetime learning. The idea that we finish our education when we're 26 or 27 is, I think, going to be, people are going to laugh at that down the road. I think we're going to either be going to university at different stages, maybe when we're 40, maybe when we're 55, maybe when we're 75, maybe we'll be using technology, but I think we're going to have to do it, but also for labor, because we have to have more old people working. It's just a fact. The pension reform that was done in the UK right after World War II, which was put in place in 1937, when they gave people, it was 65 was the mandatory retirement, you got a pension. The life expectancy was 66 and a half. Okay, so